Why don't we start? And other people will join as they come in. And uh, welcome, Ryan, and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us for what promises to be um, a great afternoon. I still have to admit people. Uh, some of you came last spring when Brian spoke informally to the study group we have, and then I may be the only one who also heard Brian in person in Chicago at the Socialism Conference. And I appreciated the fact that while some things were familiar, that the framework was different. And I imagine now, 6 months later, you've have a lot of new and different things to say. Uh, Brian has written a fantastic new biography of Hubert Harrison, um, bits of which we read in one of our classes here, along with reading some of Harrison's original work. And some people, despite Harrison being a forbidden genius, are probably familiar with him from other exposure. Um, and I'm not going to go through your biography, which is there in brief, but you've also published other things and written for many publications. And as I was just saying informally, have spoken extensively about the book. I can say, especially from the socialism appearance, which was a crowded standing room only event at the Socialism Conference, Brian is a great speaker and really makes this wonderful book come alive. And the format will be, Brian, you can, I don't know how long your presentation is, but you can speak for a while, and I would ask everybody to hold their questions. And then when you finish, we'll open it up for discussion. If you have questions, or if you want to make a comment, you can raise your hand, but it will probably be easier if you either raise your hand using the Zoom raise hand thing or write stack in the meeting chat. If you do that, don't write anything else with it because that'll be distracting. And in general, especially at the beginning, I would rather you, if you have things to say that you, well, I'd rather you speak in your own voice than say them. But if you'd rather just make a comment in the chat, you can do that and we'll read it. This presentation is being recorded, and with events like this, with the speakers, with our guests' permission, we do put it on YouTube. But when we do that, we make an effort to edit out everybody except for our guests. But if you're especially concerned, I would encourage you to change your name. You can, everybody, by clicking the three dots next to their picture, you can rename yourself and you can hide your picture if you want to remain anonymous. But if you've looked at anything else that we've put on the YouTube channel, with special exceptions where we really build something as like a community discussion, we just keep the camera on our guests. And I hope everybody here is on the MEP mailing list. We have had a busy fall, and we just sent out a newsletter with more things coming up late fall and into the winter. If you're not in the mailing list and you got here some other way, you can let me know in the chat and I'll send you our last newsletter. So with that, Ryan, it looks like you're more than organized. You even have a PowerPoint. I hope that doesn't scare anybody off, but
Well, hopefully it'll just offer some visual aid for those of us who are visual learners. Um, Thanks so much, Steve, for inviting me back. I am going to share some comments and slides from my PowerPoint, some of which will overlap with what we talked about the last time. I believe it was in July, um, and some of which will be new stuff. So hopefully, whether you were here or not last time, you'll be able to get on the same page. And I do recommend the previous session we did in July. I know that's on YouTube because I did cover quite a lot in that session, some of which I'm not going to talk about today, just in the interest of keeping things different. But I did share that a little bit about my background. For those who don't know me, was born to a white American mother and black Kenyan father. Educated at quote unquote high ranking schools, Cornell, Tufts, and Oxford. But really, I come to this work as an activist, more so than as a scholar. I've been involved in a whole number of different movements of different kinds for socialism, anti-imperialism, Palestine, decolonizing education, climate justice. And I wanted to just share a quick clip from the Occupy movement. This was back in 2011. I'm sure many of us on this call will remember that moment. But this is a clip from me speaking at the opening rally for Occupy Boston, which is where I was living at the time. And it'll just give you kind of a sense of the energy of that moment as part of my activist background.
Do we say? Do we say? How long do we say? People doing us. Younger and old and fatherless. And
I think that you need to put the link in the chat, and I need to
Okay.
share it because we can't really hear anything.
Can't really hear it. Okay, that's fine. I'll put the link in the chat.
So
But
it looks like you started at 11 minutes.
yeah, I started at 11 minutes. Yeah, let me drop the link in the chat so folks can see later. It was just quite a very electric and inspiring moment because we were launching this occupation in the financial district of Boston. And it was part of a larger nationwide movement that was developing and spreading very quickly based on the occupation of Zuccotti Park in New York, what was called Occupy Wall Street, a movement targeting the 1%, and really calling out the economic inequality that is so prevalent in our society. So let me get back to the part of why I share that, of course, is because, as I was saying, I really come to this work as an activist more than as a scholar. And the Occupy movement was one of the many sort of examples of how I became more radical. So, talking about radicalism, which is in the title, I wanted to also define that in the way that Ella Baker does here. I hope everyone can see my slides here again on PowerPoint. But she says, in order for us as poor and oppressed people to become part of a society that's meaningful, the system under which we now exist has to be radically changed. This means we're going to have to learn to think in radical terms. I use the term radical in its original meaning, getting down to and understanding the root cause. It means facing a system that does not lend itself to your needs and devising means by which you change that system. So yeah, that's what I mean when I say, radical or radicalism, getting down to the root of the problem. Um, Another quick quote I'll share just to start us off. This is from Harrison, Hubert Harrison, his message for the youth about education. He said, "Get education not only in school and college, but in books and newspapers, in marketplaces, institutions, and movements. Prepare by knowing, and never think you know until you've listened to 10 others who know differently and have survived the shock." I think this really encapsulates a kind of Harrisonian method for getting knowledge, which is, you test what you know against a lot of others and see if you survive the shock. And because Harrison employed this method, he forces us to learn new things when we study him, because often he has evaluated and considered different perspectives that we might not have, right? So my brief overview, I did a version of this last time, but I do want to touch on some of the key aspects of Harrison's thought as an African, as a freethinker, as a socialist, Black internationalist, free lover, and then of course some comments about his erasure. I did mention this last time, but for those who weren't here, Hubert Henry Harrison's born in St. Croix to plantation workers on that Caribbean island. He becomes an orphan at 16, moves to New York City right at the turn of the 19th into the 20th century, like so many Caribbean migrants are doing in this moment, right? Folks who are seeking better job opportunities and educational opportunities are moving to the U.S. Now, they're shocked when they get to the US. One example of why they're shocked is the racism of the United States, the virulent white supremacy. Here's an example where a Congolese man, Otabanga, was placed into the monkey house section of the Bronx Zoo, literally showing you, how Africans were viewed as creatures to be put in a zoo. At this very same time, right next door in Harlem, Harrison writes this diary entry, a pledge to Mother Africa, which ends by saying, "Take my youth, my labors, my love, my life, my all, and do thou when I shall have died for thee, take me to thy bosom, an untamed, untamable African." And I just find this a really refreshing rejection of the anti-Black and anti-African racism of the day, and a model for people of African descent in the diaspora in terms of reclaiming their ancestral inheritance as African people. Harrison had what I call a radical humility in his politics toward Africa. That's perfectly exemplified by this quote here, where he says, "Instead of futile expectations from the doubtful generosity of white land grabbing, let us American Negroes go to Africa, live among the natives, and learn what they have to teach us, for they have much to teach us." This really turned the whole train of colonial thinking on its head. Most figures, Black and white, saw Africa and Africans as people who needed to be Christianized and civilized and uplifted, quote unquote, developed from without. And here Harrison is saying, no, forget about that. Let's see what they can teach us, because we need to learn from Africans. Harrison did a deep study of ancient African history. Here's an example of one of his pithy statements on that subject. He says, "Today it's necessary to pretend that the ancient Ethiopians, whose very name means black-faced, and Egyptians were quote unquote white, since otherwise geometry, architecture, astronomy, medicine, iron smelting, and religion would have to be credited to people who would be forced in our country to ride in Jim Crow cars." In other words, the African people, the Black people who created all these things, would be forced to ride in segregated accommodations in the 20s unless classicists created a narrative about how Egypt was not an African civilization, or how Ethiopians and ancient Egyptians were white. And that's the other thing that shocked Caribbean migrants to the United States, is the Jim Crow segregation, right? This idea of whites being able to access some places and everybody else accessing other places. Of course, African Americans were disfranchised largely in the South. That's another key piece of context that I mentioned last time, as well as, of course, the grisly specter of lynching, which was a national epidemic in the early 20th century during Harrison's lifetime. So one of the first things Harrison does is the first kind of race-focused jobs, you could say, or racial empowerment efforts that he's involved in, is he works in the White Rose Home for Colored Girls. This was basically an organization that was doing uplift work for African American and African Caribbean migrants to New York, helping young women and girls get some lodging, get some food, get some help with applying for jobs and things of that nature. It was run by Francis Reynolds Keyser, who is pictured here in the middle. Harrison taught a course in Black history at the White Rose Home. He also would supervise the boys' club. Some of these women had, sons who they had brought with them as they were migrating to New York. And Harrison breaks from religion. I mentioned this last time as well, right? He writes this letter to Francis Keyser, his mentor, explaining that is an agnostic, which to Harrison simply means that a man shall not say he knows or believes that which he has no scientific grounds for professing to know or believe. And Harrison, in doing this, becomes a very unique figure. He joins the free thought movement. Very few Black people were in the free thought fold. Um, Harrison writes articles like this one, decrying the fact that church property in New York was evading payment of taxes. And this is part of a larger free thought movement, which I mentioned last time. I won't go too much into it, but these were folks who were secular, who were sort of what we now think of as secular humanists or atheists and agnostics, challenging the church, challenging Christian dogma, and demanding the separation of church and state. Mark Twain was one of the many sort of free thinkers of the day. And Harrison is unique for being, as far as I can tell, the most prominent Black freethinker of that era. So the special edition of the Truth Seeker magazine, which was one of the main free thought magazines, featured only one Black thinker. And here's a picture of that Black thinker, Hubert Harrison. It says this colored free thought street speaker was assaulted by the strong armed squad of Catholics who objected to hearing their religion criticized. It's a story about how Harrison employed armed self-defense to save his own life from a mob of Irish Catholics who were coming for him because he was speaking about, his criticisms of the church and Christianity more generally. Now, lest anybody think that Harrison was not spiritual, even though he was not religious and certainly very critical of the church. When Harrison died, his friend Ethelred Brown, a pastor of the Harlem Community Church, renamed his church the Hubert Harrison Memorial Church as a gesture of respect for Harrison's legacy and the spiritual power that he carried in Harlem. And there's not too many African Americans who've gotten a distinction like that. Harriet Tubman was called Moses for leading her people out of bondage. There is the St. John Coltrane Church, one of the only other churches named for a Black American. And there's some other examples, but let's keep going to the next section. I do have a whole chapter in the book on what I call the outdoor grioversity. This is the street corner speaking culture in Harlem that Harrison is helping to pioneer and develop. Harrison literally spoke to audiences large enough to block traffic, as pictures like this from that time period really convey, right? There was this oral culture, this outdoor stepladder oratory that Harrison and other speakers became masters of. And this was, one of the sort of main avenues for social and political engagement, given that there was no internet, there was no television, there was very little Black radio programming in the 1910s and 20s. So being outdoors and talking to people and engaging on the street was actually very, very common. I mentioned also last time, this is the era of the robber barons, right? The Rockefellers and Carnegies and J.P. Morgans of the world, who had not only immense economic power because of their control of monopoly corporations, but also immense political power. As you can see from pictures like this, J.P. Morgan literally rowing the boat, and Uncle Sam is kind of a secondary player in the picture. Rockefeller had the famous Standard Oil Company, which was an oil monopoly, and Rockefeller also had immense power over government, as you can see him holding, Washington, D.C. in the palm of his hand, basically right here. These were the billionaire oligarchs of Harrison's day. And I wanted to share a poem from Langston Hughes because it's relevant, and because Hughes was very close to Harrison. They were close friends, and because I have a lot of Langston Hughes poems in the book. So this is God to Hungry Child by Langston Hughes. He said, "Hungry child, I didn't make this world for you. You didn't buy any stock in my railroad. You didn't invest in my corporation. Where are your shares in Standard Oil? I made the world for the rich, and the will be rich, and the have always been rich, not for you, hungry child." And I can't help but notice that this poem hits just as hard in 2025 given the genocide and starvation of children in Gaza, than it did whenever Langston wrote it a century ago or more. The most powerful Black figure at the time, in the early 1900s, was Booker T. Washington. And so I talk in the book about how, Harrison made criticisms of Washington, who, for example, this one, he said, the prevailing social philosophy among Negroes, that which white capitalism will pay to have them taught, is one of submission and acquiescence in political servitude. Of course, Washington denounced efforts to agitate politically for the right to vote or against lynching. Here's a picture of the Tuskegee Institute faculty with Booker T. Washington sitting here right in the front row with his left leg crossed over. And then right next to him is Andrew Carnegie, because Carnegie and Rockefeller and some of these robber barons were donors to the Tuskegee Institute. Harrison made criticisms of the fact that Washington, would claim that if Black people would stop insisting on their grievances and, just get property and acquire manual skills, then their grievances would go away. But he pointed out that in Kansas City, for example, a colored man was putting up a $5,000 building and it was dynamited by his white neighbors. Yet Mr. Washington says that if the Negro will become a house owner, he will get the goodwill and respect of his white neighbors. And so Harrison concludes, Mr. Washington is a great leader by the grace of the white people who elect colored people's leaders for them, but he has great limitations. So you can imagine this was not received well, this criticism of Washington. Washington didn't receive any criticism well, and in fact built a whole machinery of repression called the Tuskegee machine, buying up newspapers, putting pressure on editors to toe the right line and not criticize Washington. And he's able to use this Tuskegee machine to get Harrison fired from his job at the post office. So here's a letter from Charles Anderson, one of the lieutenants of Booker T. Washington in the New York Republican Party. He writes this letter to Washington, says, "Do you remember Hubert Harrison? He's the man who wrote 2 nasty articles against you in the New York Sun. He's a clerk in the post office. The postmaster is my personal friend, as you probably know. Harrison has had charges proffered against him, and I think he's liable to be dismissed from the service. Can you see the hand? I think you can. Please destroy this, that it may not fall under another eye. I will attend to Harrison." So there you have it, right? The Harrison, sure enough, loses his postal job to this dastardly retaliation by a functionary of the Tuskegee machine under Booker T. Washington. But far from disciplining Harrison, as it was intended to do, it actually spurred Harrison's further radicalization. This is the time of, convict leasing. This is the time of steel workers getting exploited. It's a time of child laborers getting exploited. And this is why the industrial workers of the world is growing rapidly. And Harrison is interested in the industrial workers of the world as a radical labor union, trying to build workers, bring them all into one big union. He actually joins the Socialist Party shortly after his firing from his postal job. Harrison becomes one of the key early Black secular voices in the Socialist Party. There were socialists, Black socialists before Harrison, but they were mostly Christian, church-going socialists. Harrison is a free thinker, as I mentioned, very critical of the church. And this is the heyday, right, when Eugene Debs was the perennial candidate, winning famously 6% of the vote for president in 1912, the highest any socialist presidential candidate has ever gotten. And Debs made clear what he believed the party stood for. He said, "We demand the machinery of production in the name of the workers and control of the society in the name of the people. We demand the abolition of capitalism and wage slavery, the surrender of the capitalist class, complete control of industry by the workers, and we demand the earth for all the people." And Harrison campaigned for Debs for president in 1912 and in 1916. And Debs, to his credit, he opposed racial discrimination. He welcomed Black workers into the labor and socialist movements. He called on Black workers to reject the false doctrines of meekness and humility and refused to speak to segregated audiences when he was in the South. These, I think, are great aspects of Debs, but also there's some stuff to criticize, I think, about Debs, and we should just be honest about that. In the Negro and Socialism, for example, Debs said there's no Negro question outside of the labor question, the working class struggle. He said the Socialist Party had nothing special to offer the Negro, and that we cannot make special appeals to all the races because the class struggle is colorless. I think looking back on it, we can recognize this kind of class colorless idea as problematic, right? As a kind of color blindness that we would see as problematic today. And I appreciate how many people on the left want to defend Debs and try to explain away all of his flaws, but I think it's more prudent to just acknowledge them, to just be honest about them, own up to them, so that we can understand that no one's perfect, right? Um, Debs said, in capitalism, the Negro question is a grave one and will continue to grow more threatening as the contradictions and complications of capitalist society multiply. But this need not worry us. Let them settle the Negro question in their way if they can. We have nothing to do with it, for that is their fight. Now, to Black people, this sounds a bit callous, right? If you're saying, well, lynching and disfranchisement and segregation, that's their problem. Again, I think we need to just be critical of Debs in this place and just be honest about his limitations in terms of his racial politics. That will certainly be much more compelling to potential Black folks in our audience if we're trying to get them interested in socialism. They'll be more interested if we can be honest in our critiques of a Debs than if we just try to explain everything away. And this is where Harrison comes in, right? Because he's pioneering a Black secular socialist analysis. He's one of the first Black socialists to articulate a historical analysis of race and class in the United States through a sort of historical materialist or Marxist framework. He organizes the first official Black-led party formation, the Colored Socialist Club in Harlem, to recruit Black workers and organizers to socialism. And he calls for special attention to the specific needs of Black workers. I won't go through all of this because I spoke about it last time. And people can check out, that video from July if they want to go into more depth. Harrison spoke he was the only Black speaker at the Paterson, New Jersey Silk Strike alongside Elizabeth Gurley Flynn and Big Bill Haywood, some of the most radical labor leaders in the country. And when the U.S. enters World War I, that's when I think a whole number of changes, get set off. For one, Harrison calls this the White World War, right? And Marcus Garvey forms his organization, the Universal Negro Improvement Association. He's trying to build a Tuskegee-style institute in Jamaica on the model of Booker T. Washington. Harrison, meanwhile, founds the Liberty League of Negro Americans, which was designed to basically make the South, quote unquote, safe for democracy, which is to say, highlighting lynching and disfranchisement and segregation as problems for the U.S.'s stated goal of making the world safe for democracy. The Liberty League is significant because it influences a lot of subsequent formations. The African Blood Brotherhood, for example, comes out of, in part, the work that the Liberty League established, people like Cyril Briggs and Grace Campbell. The Garvey movement, as I'll speak to, in many ways grows out of the Liberty League because Garvey joins Harrison's Liberty League and learns a lot of strategy and tactics there. The Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, right? A. Philip Randolph and Chandler Owen were deeply influenced by Harrison's Black socialist politics. This is the time of the Espionage and Sedition Acts. Much like today, there was state repression and penalties imposed on anybody who wanted to speak out against the White World War, as Harrison called it. Much like there's penalties for speaking out against Israel's genocide in Gaza today, or speaking up for Palestine. So a number of leftists and progressives and radicals were actually imprisoned. A. Philip Randolph, Eugene Debs, Emma Goldman being some of the examples of this. And so that was one threat. Another threat, besides state repression, was the danger of capitulation, right? And I spoke to this briefly last time as well, that Du Bois actually capitulates during the war. And he writes this infamous editorial, where he says, "Let us, while this war lasts, forget our special grievances and close our ranks shoulder to shoulder with our fellow white citizens who are fighting for democracy." Du Bois, was the principal advocate of and voice of the special grievances of African Americans. So for him to suddenly be saying, well, let's forget our grievances and get behind the war, really shocked a lot of people. And Harrison was able to avoid both prison and capitulation by using the government's rhetoric to expose the contradictions. So he says, America's in this war to win. The nation will brook no attempt to compromise its principles. The world, the whole world, Tennessee as well as Turkey, must be made safe for democracy, and we must fight on until this end is accomplished. So he's pretending to support the war aim of democracy, but he's actually just showing up the hypocrisy of a United States in which Tennessee and many other parts are not democratic, even though the U.S. claims to be fighting abroad for democracy. And so Du Bois gets exposed by Harrison. Harrison writes an article called The Descent of Dr. Du Bois. And Harrison says, Du Bois is regarded much in the same way as a knight in the Middle Ages who has had his armor stripped from him, his arms reversed, and his spurs hacked off. This ruins him as an influential person among Negroes at this time, whether he becomes captain or remains an editor. The point being that Du Bois was attempting to become a captain in military intelligence. This is this is the era of deep state Du Bois, which a lot of Du Boisians don't like to talk about because it's embarrassing, right? Du Bois sold out. He tried to join the government. But once again, I think it's better and more prudent for us to be honest about this so that we can learn the lesson from it, right? I don't think we get a Du Bois of Black Reconstruction in the 1930s, the radical Du Bois, right? The Marxist-oriented Du Bois. We don't get that one without the criticisms of the Hubert Harrisons of the world, right? If we think about how we become more radical, it's not because we're never challenged. It's because we're challenged by people who are more radical than us, right? So Harrison, being more radical than Du Bois, challenged Du Bois, exposed his sellout, and I think that fueled Du Bois's radicalization because, to his credit, Du Bois regretted his behavior during World War I for the rest of his life. Harrison built and helped lead the Liberty Congress of Negro Americans during the war. This was the only independent gathering, nationwide gathering of African American dissidents during World War I. This was in the summer of 1918. You see Harrison in the front row here, second from the right, next to William Monroe Trotter, who was another key Black radical figure in the early 20th century who had challenged Booker T. Washington and fought for African Americans. And this effort was in the tradition of, the March on Washington movement of the 40s, which A. Philip Randolph, a protege of Harrison's, was, building and ended up actually aborting because he didn't need felt the need to go through with it. But then, of course, in the 60s, there was an actual March on Washington. Each of these events, was designed to put Black pressure on Washington, D.C. and are part of, I think, a common lineage. Let me move forward into the last piece, which is Harrison's international politics. I mean, this is the time of the Russian Revolution, obviously a time of world revolution, frankly. Harrison had commented that Bolshevism is the salvation of America because he was interested, like many Black radicals were, in the transformative social change that the Russian Revolution produced, the overthrow of capitalism and imperialism and Tsarism in Russia, workers taking power, workers and peasants coming to power in Russia. There was a general strike in Seattle in the post-war period, and there were uprisings and anti-colonial rebellions all over the world. That's why I call this a time of world revolution. From the Easter Rising in Ireland to revolts in Haiti and South Africa and Kenya, the Mexican Revolution. And Harrison, as I mentioned earlier, catalyzed the rise of Garvey and Garveyism, which was one of the many sort of products of this post-war political awakening among colonized people of the world. We can talk more about Garvey and Garveyism, but it was very influential on a whole generation of African nationalists, from Kwame Nkrumah and Jomo Kenyatta to the parents of Malcolm X. Even Ho Chi Minh took in Garvey's speeches when he was living in New York as a young person. And Garveyism becomes this massive international Black nationalist movement with branches on both banks of the Atlantic Ocean. And still, Garvey had his limitations, right? He had an imperial vision, right? Wanted a Black empire in which the sun should never set. And Harrison contrasted sharply with this, and as editor of Garvey's Negro World, ends up writing an editorial calling for a colored international, which would be a complement to the kind of Eurocentric internationalism of the second, and in this case, third internationals, the Comintern, which was a federation, as folks on this call will know, a federation or agglomeration of mostly European socialist or communist parties. Harrison is saying we need some internationalism for the colonized world, the colored world, the darker races who are mercilessly exploited by capitalist imperialism, and which were not, unfortunately, very well represented in the Comintern. So this idea of a colored international is part of how Harrison is theorizing anti-imperialism in race-conscious terms, not just anti-capitalist and anti-imperialist, but race-conscious terms as well. Of course, we can't not mention Harrison's Black free love politics. I think chapter 6 of my book is probably the most controversial, but also in some ways perhaps the most generative, because Harrison was a free lover, a pioneering Black free lover, the first African American to call for decriminalizing access to contraception, to denounce church and state repression of sexuality, to give a public-facing series of lectures on sex education, and to explicitly defend a love style based on freedom and variety, in part on the grounds that Harrison, as Harrison put it, we are not monogamists by nature. We can talk more about this in the discussion. I think in the interest of time, I'll just move on, because I did speak about this last time, the church repression of sexuality, the state repression of sexuality, and of course, the anti-Black suppression of sexuality, when you have lynching as a national epidemic, and often castration that goes along with that lynching, as part of a larger architecture of what Tommy Curry would call racist misandry, right? The Jim Crow narrative about Black men as a sexual threat to the purity of white women. For Harrison to come out as a Black free lover in this context, right, is almost unthinkably revolutionary, because he's challenging the church and the state and the Jim Crow racist ideology that held Black men to be sexual brutes. So why was Harrison erased from history? I did speak about this last time as well. One of the reasons Harrison is erased is the whole quote-unquote Harlem Renaissance narrative, which was sort of deliberately designed to exclude the race and class radicalism of the post-war New Negro awakening. So, Alain Locke writes this famous anthology, The New Negro, compiles all these sort of arts and culture pieces to basically say the new Negro is an artistic and cultural expression that's going to solve the race problem by showing the creative gifts of Black people in literature and in art. And this narrative erases essentially the Black socialist and communists, the Garveyites, the blues women, all these other kind of more radical things that are happening in Harlem at the time, in favor of what one white publisher said they wanted, which was art, not anger. And so if you take this example and apply it to everything else, you realize Harrison was erased by multiple people who had reason to fear him or to not remember him. The Renaissance narrative boosters is one example. They didn't like that Harrison was critical of the whole Renaissance narrative. The Garveyites didn't like that Harrison was very critical of Marcus Garvey's imperialism and authoritarian behavior. The socialists didn't like that Harrison was critical of the Socialist Party's race politics, right, and their white race first attitude when it came to Black workers. I want to give a massive shout out to Jeff Perry before I stop, just because Perry's done so much work. May he rest in power. He did so much work to restore and revive Harrison. And he's the only other scholar that had done book-length treatments of Harrison before my book, with his Harrison Reader and then of his 2-volume biography of Harrison, which is detailed and meticulous, but also extremely long, at nearly 1,200 pages between the 2 volumes. So that's where my book comes in, which is punchy, thematic, written for a general audience, not just for scholars. So yeah, I'll stop there, and I guess we can open it up for comments, conversation, and whatnot.
Maybe I'll start it off while everybody else maybe is thinking, and then I'll watch who else wants to speak. So I was especially puzzled by this idea of erasure. And even while we were reading about and from Harrison, after you came and spoke, it yeah, it was kind of front and center, like this man who had so much influence sort of disappeared. I first heard of Harrison from Ted Allen, who influenced Jeff Perry. There was this whole chain. But what I wonder about is that and I'll say that in the book, you don't, you're not trying to throw the people who erased uh, Harrison, you don't make them into, you know, completely miserable people. They were just influenced. They had their own influences. They did what they did. But by focusing so much on the erasure, it made me wonder, well, what about all the positive, lasting influences that Harrison had, not just by rediscovery? Um, and I like, just for example, when you talked about the griot versity,
Yeah.
and that came after he had been doing other things in his own education and just sort of critiquing things. It just made me think that even if people didn't have the opportunity to read about it that much, that it's sort of came into the culture of how to do popular education, popular political and cultural education. And how do these influences transmit from one generation to the next? So I'm not saying the book was too negative about Harrison's um, legacy, because you do get back to that towards the end of the book. Um, but how do we balance out his suppression from the fact that he did influence all these things, years later, a generation later? I'll stop there.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. Do you want me to respond right away, or did you want to take?
Yeah, and we won't necessarily do that with everybody, but I'm just trying to. Usually, it takes people a few minutes before the the, the kettle boils. So
Okay, sure. So, I think that Harrison is an example of someone who, although he was kind of written out of history and disremembered in particular ways after his death, as you said, he did leave a lasting impact. And there's a number of of examples that we could speak to of that. So the outdoor grioversity, for example, this culture of street corner speaking that I speak to in chapter 3, that is a tradition that would continue right in Harlem, especially into the era of Malcolm X, right in the 1960s, when you could find Malcolm speaking on Lenox Avenue in Harlem, what is now Malcolm X Avenue in Harlem. Another example is the Schomburg Center, right? Harrison was very close with Arturo Schomburg, and actually served on the committee that helped transfer and managed the transfer of Schomburg's books from Brooklyn, where Schomburg lived, all the way up to Harlem, the 135th Street branch, New York Public Library, where it became the foundation for what is now the Schomburg Center. And I'm happy that the Schomburg Center, is celebrating their 100th anniversary. And so I hope to get down there to do a book event. They've been super busy with with their programming. But it was Harrison a century ago that helped found the Schomburg Centers, is what I'm trying to say. So that's another institutional example of Harrison's legacy. He was a major patron of that 135th Street branch of the library. He would give talks there. He helped cultivate an intellectual culture on the corner of 135th and Lenox, where that Harlem Library branch is. He would speak on, to huge crowds right outside that intersection. And then lastly, through the Garvey movement, Harrison had a massive impact all over the world. I mean, Garvey and Garveyism, the Universal Negro Improvement Association was the largest international organization of African people at least up to that point in history. And so, for example, the Kenyan flag, which I have here on a bracelet, this red, black, and green is these are the colors of the Garvey movement flag, which was a red, black, and green for Pan-African sovereignty. And the Garvey movement's red, black, and green was based on the Liberty League's black, brown, and yellow, which Harrison developed in the Liberty League before Garvey came and joined the Liberty League and got the idea of a tricolor for Black liberation. And so Harrison had a massive impact on a whole number of people, right? I mean, the flag of Ghana has a black star in the middle of it as an homage to Garvey's Black Star Line, and because Kwame Nkrumah, the first prime minister of Ghana, openly acknowledged that Garveyism had more impact on his thinking than anything else. And Garveyism would not have become Garveyism, would not have become a globally impactful thing if not for the elements in the Liberty League that Harrison taught Garvey, right? The race first doctrine, the Black internationalist politics, supporting people all over the world, building a mass movement organization for Black people that combined African Caribbeans and African Americans in the same organization. That hadn't been done before the Liberty League, at least not in a sort of social movement political way, right? So without Harrison and the Liberty League, I don't think Marcus Garvey ever transcends his fixation on building a Tuskegee Institute in Jamaica. And so I think, there's a critical lasting influence that Harrison has in that sense as well.
Well, I have some follow up to that. Just fair warning, but we should go on. So Jamie, and then Carl.
Hi, Brian. This
Hi.
is Jamie. I'm out in Washington. Steve sent out a picture with the announcement of this talk that had a photographer standing behind um, Harrison while he was giving a talk. And in the audience, in the second row, there was a white woman with her head, like her hat down, blocking her face while the photograph was being taken. And I don't know why that jumped out at me. For one, I like to think I would have been that woman at that time. And for two, you talked about that the time when somebody speaking on the corner, standing up on a box, was an exciting thing. Where now we have everything everywhere all at once, and so it would have been. I could relate to how exciting that would have been of a time to be alive at a time when those kind of moments could happen. But it led me further into thinking, and I don't know if I have a particular question or just really want to acknowledge my gratitude for you. When you resurrect the history of a man like Harrison, it seems to me like you're really honing in with a microscope or a laser on the ways that the powers that be will repress everyone, some more than others. And you've touched on that in your talk, but that white woman, maybe she was hiding her head on purpose because she was going to get some rebuke for being at the talk of this upstart Black man. Maybe, you talked about the different positions that different activists have taken and the flaws that they had looking at it from today. And I guess there's no answer to that question, or we wouldn't still be having the discussion. How does one best go about moving the dynamics toward humanism and kindness and equality? I guess there's the personal angle. What do I feel best doing? There's the collective angle. What is the quality of the times? What is the moment? And then maybe there's a professional or educated person like yourself who might have an actual opinion on what is the best way to move things forward, and not get caught in some of the traps that you've sort of highlighted. I don't really think they're traps, because I think the powers that be will find a way to undermine no matter what anyone does at any level, trying to create more fairness. But anyway, that's what's on my mind. I hope that's not too jumbled.
No, that was great. And let's get Carl's comment, and then Brian. So Carl, I just would say, has been co-conspirator and invaluable ally or partner in developing the study we did this past year, and also read a lot of these things back before people knew about them. So go ahead, Carl. must unmute. I just pressed the must unmute button. I can't unmute, but
There we go. I said, I got my education on Hubert Harrison early, sitting at the feet of Harry Haywood, and going through the importance of the Garvey movement in his Black Bolshevik biography, and also with Ted Allen and Jeff Perry. But one question that always comes up to my mind, and this may be somewhat naive, or maybe it's just something I don't know. It seems to me that Garvey was the agitation and propagandist par excellence. He was really almost unmatched. In some of his writings, he renders Du Bois more profound and more eloquent, covering the same material. Not always, but that is a difficult thing to do, given the fact that Du Bois's writings overall are very powerful and eloquent. But I'm thinking, where's his inner Lenin? It's one thing to be a newspaper editor and a writer, but where are your string of worker correspondents? Where are your, huge network of people to distribute your paper? To a certain extent, it happened with the sleeping car porters. I think they used to take huge bundles of the Chicago Defender, and they would take it on the rails with them, and wherever cities they went through, they made sure that stacks of the Chicago Defender were left in the train stations and other places for people to pick them up. Even that was a rather primitive form of organization. But I think maybe the answer lies is he tried to do that with the Garvey movement and succeeded to a certain extent, but not well enough to overcome the internal divisions within that movement. So anyway, that's my thought, and you can put it in the form of a question. I'd be interested in anything you have to say.
well, two pretty different comments, both good. And Brian, go ahead.
Yeah, so I'll start with Jamie's comments. Yeah, I mean, when we're asking what is the best way to move things forward, I think that one of the things that we really have to do is learn from history. I never liked history because it was boring. It was never taught to me when I was in middle school or high school, or even in college. Frankly, I never took a single history course as an undergraduate. Now that probably sounds strange, coming from a history professor, but I just never had somebody to make it interesting. And it wasn't until I became an activist in 2004. I remember very, very clearly my first march, as I mentioned in the preface of the book, marching on the 1-year anniversary of George W. Bush's Iraq War. In March of 2004, I was marching, holding a banner saying U.S. out of Haiti, because the U.S. was backing the overthrow of the Aristide government in Haiti for the second time. And I was interested I was coming to a consciousness about not just the war in Iraq or, the U.S. backed coup in Haiti, but U.S. imperialism more generally, right? It wasn't until I was trying to change the world that I started to realize why history matters, because it explains the world that we have now. And once I realized I needed to understand the world we have now in order to change it, the value of history became suddenly much clearer. Because the thing about this is, like, yes, state repression is powerful. As you were saying, Jamie, the powers that be will repress any threat that they perceive to their rule, no matter what shape or form it comes up in. But the point I would make there is that while state repression is powerful and inevitable, it's not all powerful, right? So there would be no American Revolution if state repression was all powerful, because the British Crown would have just shut down all the agitation happening in these 13 colonies that become the United States, right? There would be no French Revolution if the King Louis was all powerful. There would be no Haitian Revolution if, Napoleon Bonaparte was all powerful. There would be no civil rights movement in this country, or Black Power movement in this country, or labor movement in this country, if state repression was all powerful, right? And so the fact that it's not all powerful and that we've actually made a lot of progress and even seen revolutions teaches us, once again, the value of history, right? It teaches us that we can overcome factors like state repression. But I think we're very unlikely to do that if we don't study it, right? If we don't really try to learn from the past, learn all that we can about what we can do personally, what we can do collectively, and so that we can so that we can move forward or find the best way forward in such a way that we're not repeating mistakes or falling into some of the same traps and pitfalls that past movements and past generations have done. As for Carl's question, I love this idea of the inner Lenin. That's a nice concept. The worker correspondence. I mean, Harrison, the greatest, I think the greatest moment, as you said, of his influence was probably his tenure as editor of Garvey's Negro World newspaper. I mean, first of all, Harrison completely redesigned that newspaper. Much like Lenin saw the Iskra, right, as a key sort of tool and organizing scaffolding for building an organization with a network of people across Russia that could distribute it and read it and talk about it. Harrison, redesigns and refashions the Negro World when he becomes editor in 1920, January of 1920. He expands it to a 10-page paper. He adds the sections on poetry for the people because poetry was very popular. He adds a section on West Indian news notes, so specific reports from the Caribbean that would be part of the papers. He adds the readers Q&A section so that readers could write in and have their questions answered in print in the paper. He redesigns the layout of the paper, and he does some other things in the Negro World offices, a filing system for correspondence with from the paper and other people, interlocutors. And thanks to Harrison's editorship, it becomes the premier newspaper of the African diaspora. It goes from something like 10,000 issues when Harrison takes over to I believe it's around 50,000 issues in circulation just a few months after Harrison has assumed the editorship. And once again, this is it's a sad story because Garvey, as Harrison put it, Garvey had an insane egotism and couldn't tolerate anybody in his organization that would outshine him, whether intellectually or spiritually or politically. And Harrison was not inclined. By the time he gets, by the time you get to the rise of Garveyism and Garvey's asking Harrison to edit his paper, Harrison is not looking to be a yes man for anybody. He's he's had his experience in the Socialist Party. He's had his experience in other venues, and so he's not looking to be told what to do or just take orders from on high uncritically. But that's exactly what Garvey demanded from his quote unquote subordinates, at least according to Harrison. And so the Garvey movement, like the Socialist Party, was unable to retain Harrison's membership, and I think suffered the loss of a number of important figures or potential figures because of that sort of top-down authoritarian attitude of Garvey, where he had to be at the center of the universe in all things and in all decisions. And that's why I have a whole chapter, in my book talking about Harrison's critique of Garvey and his attempt to push the Garvey movement in a more class-conscious, anti-imperialist, and political party building direction, because those were not actually elements of Booker T. Washington's strategy on which Garvey was initially so focused, right? These were things that Harrison was bringing to the table and trying to get the Garvey movement to do something about Haiti, for example, which was under U.S. military occupation during, starting with Woodrow Wilson in 1914, 1915. Harrison posed a very powerful question to the Garvey movement, right? Which is, well, what are we doing about Haiti? Given that we have the right to protest the U.S. and we're in the U.S., we're in the belly of the beast. We might actually have some impact on U.S. foreign policy in ways that the Haitians living under occupation don't have the right to protest and don't have the same impact or access to decision makers, you know, in the United States that we do as Black people who are in the United States. And so yeah, I think the Negro world becomes that sort of newspaper of the African diaspora, and especially during Harrison's editorship, it really becomes the thing. I mean, dock workers are circulating it, you know, clandestinely into colonies in Africa and in the Caribbean where it had been banned by the British or banned by the French authorities who were ruling over these colonies. It's sad that Harrison, you know, had to leave the Garvey movement, like many other talented people. But I think it's another lesson in the need for us to build organizations today that don't focus on one individual per se, right? As Ella Baker says, we need group-centered leaders rather than leader-centered groups. It's one of my favorite quotes from Ella Baker, so I'll say it one more time. We need group-centered leaders rather than leader-centered groups.
100%. I can relate, Brian, to your story of your education and history. I had exactly the same experience. I started as an advocate in climate change about 15 years ago, and that led to now to where I am, you know, in my own advocacy and learning. I wish someone had told me when I was 12 or 14, Jamie, most of what you deal with in life outside of just your personal daily basics is going to be understanding how those who are in power are doing everything they can to retain power, and those who aren't are doing everything doing everything they can to make that situation more fair. Like if somebody had just put that idea in my head when I was a teenager, I feel like my whole life, and I was a lawyer, so I really got into the belly of the beast and still really had no idea what I was a part of. I just it's shocking now to think how I could have missed that for so long, but I didn't miss it forever. So anyway, I'm here grateful to hear you for the second time. Appreciate the work you've done on this.
You're welcome. Yeah,
Yeah.
thanks for being here.
I was going to make, not seeing any other hands up just yet. I was going to make a sort of follow-up comment to what I said before, but it relates actually to to Jamie and Carl's comments. And so over the course of the last several months, we read Black Reconstruction, we read Manisha Sinha's lovely book, and then most recently we read Hammer and Hoe by Robin Kelly. And in all three of them, and more with each one, they struggle with the question of not so much Du Bois, it's more implicit, but they struggle with the question of when the Communist International established this line of Negro Nation in the South, was that totally external? You know, was that just something that was imposed? And in those three books, in the history, they talk about how the Black radicalism of the 1930s was a meshing of oral and written traditions going back to Reconstruction, like grandparents retelling the stories of the resistance after the Civil War, with whatever the Northern organizers were teaching. And I would say to me and also to us in this study, it was a great lesson that, that the Black radical tradition was its own tradition and not just something that was imposed. In the case of Harrison, I know in the chapter on the Socialist Party, you write that he did get to read Marx and Engels. But how much that directly influenced his own thinking, given that when he writes, he tends to write in his own way, in his own words. He's not like quoting as we do today, let's say. He's trying to put things in a popular way. And just for the heck of it, I wanted to read a quote from just one from one of the articles that he wrote during the war, which you talked about his opposition to the war. Just two paragraphs from that period. The 19th Christian century saw the international expansion of capitalism. The economic system of the white peoples of Western Europe and America, and its establishment by force and fraud over the lands of the colored races, black and brown and yellow. The opening years of the 20th century present us with the sorry spectacle of these same white nations cutting each other's throat to determine which of them shall enjoy the property which has thus been acquired. And then just one more bit. And when these colored people who make up the overwhelming majority of this world demand decent treatment for themselves, the proponents of this theory, which he just talked about, accuse them of seeking social equality. For white folk to insist on the right to manage their own ancestral lands, meaning in Europe, free from the domination of tyrants, domestic and foreign, is variously described as, quote, democracy and, quote, self-determination. The Negroes, Egyptians, Hindus to seek the same thing is impudence. What wonder then that the white man's rule is felt by them to rest on a seething volcano whose slumbering fires are made up of the hundreds of millions of Chinese, Japanese, Hindus, and Africans, and on and on. And to me, you know, from passages like that and other ones, it's not the voice of Lenin, but isn't it also, in a nutshell, a theory of anti-imperialism? And so, you know, in our discussions and in my own thinking about this, I keep coming back to the idea that Harrison, as with other people independently, had their own path to socialism and to the so-called race question or Negro question. And just the fact that he and others would write in their own way itself helps to balance this idea of, you know, that socialism and communism came to Black intellectuals and Black organizers from without. You know, there were these traditions that drew on what happened in the Black churches and the Black schools going back to Reconstruction and earlier. And, you know, your work in this book helps in this rebalancing, which is part of what was on my mind in my earlier question.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great question or point that you're raising, which is that, you know, one of the things that often happens in a Eurocentric world is that we internalize elements of Eurocentrism sometimes whether we realize it or not, right? Or whether we want to or not. But in fact, you know, people of African descent, like other non-European peoples, had their own traditions, their own histories, their own cultures and languages long before European colonization, and long before they had any interaction with, you know, the Marxist tradition, for example. I mean, I think there's a fusion, right? There's a sort of mixture or creolization that happens when some of the European radicalisms reach and interact with some of the resistance and rebellion and radical traditions that are already existing before that interaction. And so yeah, I mean, what you're describing there with Harrison's analysis of the war, his race-conscious analysis of the war, was something new and different that the European radicals had not really theorized, right? They didn't talk about it as a white world war. They didn't talk about it as white nations, you know, fighting over who would colonize the darker races of the world. They had their own theoretical formulations, right? I mean, Lenin famously, you know, theorized imperialism as the highest stage of capitalism. and many other European thinkers, from Rosa Luxemburg to, Nikolai Bukharin, has that great book, Imperialism and World Economy, right? Like they had a very sharp theorization of the economic and capitalist roots of imperialism, but they didn't have the same kind of racial lens or racial lens of analysis, even though they may have supported the right of, oppressed nations to self-determination. Even that they didn't theorize in racial terms in the way that Harrison is talking about white nations, ruling over the darker races of the world. And so Harrison's call for a colored international, as I said earlier, is sort of a brilliant and kind of beautiful complement to the Third International, which is to say the Eurocentric internationalism of the socialist and communist parties in the European radical tradition, who just didn't have a lot of representation from, Africa or Asia or Latin America, at least or certainly in the early congresses of the Comintern. And the resolutions, and this is why in chapter 4 I analyze, some of the resolutions of the Comintern to show that the vast majority of the resolutions were concerning issues pertinent to Europe, because that's where most of the parties that were, in the Third International were located, Europe and the U.S. And so yeah, I think I try to imagine the possibility of what would have happened if the Third International, and this kind of colored international that Harrison is theorizing, what if they had come together, right? And sort of been able to kind of work with each other or learn from each other in more of a reciprocal relationship. Eventually, the Third International did come to a more radical position on certain questions of race, like the Black Belt thesis, which you mentioned, right? But that Black Belt thesis was not something that came from Europeans or from the Comintern in Moscow per se. It came from Black radicals, the Harry Haywoods of the world, right? M.N. Roy, an Indian Marxist, right? Trying to find language that would get these Europeans to recognize the seriousness of the question, the so-called Negro question, right? Which is that if you phrase that as a question of national liberation or national self-determination, now you're tapping into Leninist principles, right? That everybody is supposed to agree to. We're all supposed to agree to the right of nations to self-determination on principle, right? Because that's part of how the Russian Revolution won, by supporting the right of Finland and the right of Poland and the right of Ukraine to self-determination, right? The Tsarist imperialism was one of the precipitating factors of the Russian Revolution, because all the oppressed nationalities under the Tsar were hungry for self-determination. So I think by framing the Black struggle as a question of self-determination, it was like triggering the Comintern to see the importance of it in a different way. In particular, white communists in the United States, who oftentimes had their own subconscious racial attitudes, much like the Socialist Party before them did. Subconscious or conscious kind of racist attitudes were still prevalent in the 1920s, at least, in the Communist Party. And so yeah, I think the Black Belt thesis is an example of the kind of merging, right, of Black radicals with their own traditions of self-determination, from 40 Acres and a Mule after the Civil War, all the way up to Cyril Briggs's call for a separate Black state in the African Blood Brotherhood. And then Hubert Harrison calls for a separate Black state, right? The Garvey movement was calling for African sovereignty and, self-determination. There's this longer history and pattern of Black folks seeking self-determination. It finds expression in a Marxist frame in the Black Belt thesis, but that's not the end of the story either. I mean, you have in the 60s the Republic of New Africa, right, and the efforts to build a Black sort of self-determining Black Belt self-determination in that frame, right? The Republic of New Africa organization, or the idea of that in the 60s. And so yeah, I think you're right to say that there are these Black radical traditions independent of and outside of European radicalisms, but they can merge, they can talk to each other, they can be mixed and creolized in particular ways that are generative And I think actually are critical for the sort of global revolution or revolutionary liberation that we're seeking, right? Because we can't get free unless and until we all get free, right? White workers are not going to get free without black workers being a part of that, and black workers are not going to get free just by themselves either, right? We have to actually build solidarity. The nature of the system is such that we need a very large and broad degree of solidarity and unity if we want to overturn the system.
So before I call on Carl again, just say that a number of people are here, they don't have their cameras on or are here and they haven't spoken. And especially for the benefit of the people who joined late, we'd love to hear your comments. And I'll just say, sometimes these afternoon talks, they sort of come to an end in 90 minutes, but we always leave 2 hours for the discussion. So we'll see how long the comments are, and hope some other people will join in. The risk of not speaking up is that Carl, Jamie, and I will keep talking. So that's about the best incentive I can give you, Carl.
I just have a little vignette to share that's kind of instructive. I took the time to read what happened with Woodrow Wilson when he went over to Paris with his 14 points, and a very idealistic point. So he's meeting around with all these diplomats about calling for the outcome of the war had to be self-determination for all nations. And the head honchos from France and Germany and whatnot pulled him aside and said, "We can't have this. You have to change it to white nations." So Wilson didn't quite know what to do with it because in a way he agreed with them. But on the other hand, it sort of undercut his so-called universality. He didn't push it too much from there, and it never came to much. But I just thought it was a little known vignette about how race conscious our rulers were when it came to matters like self-determination.
So one thing I meant to mention before, which maybe some of you would like to talk about, is not so much just the historic tradition through the years, but also what Harrison might mean to what's going on right now. And I read one quote that you have on page 40. In 1917, Harris argued that, quote, "The Socialist Party in power would mean the absolute cessation of police brutality and the consequences, evictions by conscienceless landlords would mean bathhouses and playgrounds, municipal markets to cut down the high cost of living, municipal ownership of ice and milk. Now, for the first time," there's a word missing here, "they have a chance to win. If the Negroes of this great city, New York, want and need the things for which they stand, let them vote for the socialist candidates in the upcoming election." I mean, that sounds like almost directly from Mondami's speeches this fall. Yes? No? He's got police brutality, evictions, municipal markets. So,
Yeah.
Whether or not people still read Harrison, it's sort of in the mass consciousness. And I just wonder whether anybody found other things that will aid us today in whatever connection any of us have to the immigration struggles or other struggles, housing that are going on. Anybody? I guess probably a lot of people, I will shamefacedly admit, have not read your book yet. Yet.
So it's okay. Nobody's perfect. No, but while people are oh, I see a hand from Camilo.
Milo,
He's you're muted, Camilo. I think.
Hey, thank you. First, I just wanted to thank you for this book. I haven't had the honor of reading it yet, but I've been learning a lot just listening to this, and I'm certainly strongly enticed to pick it up as soon as I can and to go back into the previous talks. I've always been, very interested in the work of Harry Haywood, of course, Black Bolshevik, and the whole story, and Cyril Briggs and the African Blood Brotherhood. But I was much more ignorant about Hubert Harrison. Like I had heard his name, but didn't know much more. Knew a little bit about the link to Negro World and to Garvey, but that was about it. What I'm intrigued by, and I'm sure this is in the book, but of course, since I haven't read it, what I'm curious is specifically how he navigated the very complex politics of the early CP. I mean, of course, you've alluded to the politics of the early Third International, but just in Harlem, the CP and his relationship to whatever presence there was during that early period before his death, his premature death. And you also allude to the suspicious circumstances of his death. I was just, intrigued by that. Again, folks who read the book already know about that, or your previous presentations. But the other thing is I'm also intrigued by how his story overlaps in Harlem with the origins of early Latino political presence and organizing on the left, and this kind of independent thinking that Steve was alluding to, independent anti-imperialist thinking that also, of course, you were strongly emphasizing, Brian, that, ended up converging with the more advanced anti-colonial, anti-imperial theses of the Third International eventually, and fed into them, the Mexican Revolution, among other things, but included, the Puerto Rican independence movement. Both the Puerto Rican and Cuban independence movements were, among other things, hatched in New York. Jose Marti and his presence in Harlem, concretely, and New York, among others. And in the 1920s, the Puerto Rican independence movement began to have a very concrete political presence in Harlem. And it was really 1928, if I'm not mistaken, through the Anti-Imperialist League of the Americas and its chapter in Harlem. That might have been just after Harrison, but it's certainly part of the context. So I'm just curious if you can shed light on any of that. I mean, and speaking of Mamdani, I mean, of course, that's a key part of sort of the Mamdani moment, is what Mamdani has done, of course, as to Palestine solidarity, but also he's reached out very concretely to Latinos in New York and had tremendous success, first as an assemblyman, his own voting base, and his alliance with AOC. But I mean, he really reached out to Latinos, particularly around the defense of immigrant communities. And of course, in the 1920s, that was a very live issue in New York because of all the repression against immigrants during the first Red Scare, right? 1919, 1920, yep. Palmer raids. Anyway, I've already gone on too long, but sort of those threads.
Yeah. I mean, if I can just respond, in terms of his relationships with the early Communist Party, I mean, in the book, there's a line where I say he was once bitten, twice shy when it comes to the white left, because the Socialist Party, he tried to get them to take Black workers and organizers seriously and wasn't able to convince them. They actually ended up, cutting his pay, forbidding him to speak, and driving him out of the party because he was so radical. He was taking positions that the moderate and middle class leadership of the party did not think were prudent. Harrison was supporting, the Paterson Silk Strike that I mentioned, for example. He supported sabotage, industrial sabotage, as a tactic of workers, destroying the means of production if workers didn't get their demands met. This was seen as a IWW style, or an anarchistic type of labor tactic. And not to mention the racial, in addition to the supporting mass strikes and sabotage, the racial politics of Harrison, was also chafing, I think, for the leadership of the white leadership of the Socialist Party. And so they basically drove him out of the party. I mean, he just couldn't stay. They had to part ways. And ever since that moment, I think Harrison looked at white radicals with a certain kind of skepticism and kind of kept them at arm's length. Now, there is a moment in 1921 where Harrison convenes a meeting of black communists in Harlem to try to see if they could make the Garvey movement more class conscious. And he was keen on working with them because that was their main critique of Garvey and Garveyism, right? That it was a sort of petty bourgeois nationalist movement without the kind of class consciousness that real social transformation would require. And so they attempt to do that. To make a long story short, it doesn't work. Garvey expels all the ABB members and the black communists from the convention, the UNIA convention that year, 1921. But in the course of that conversation that he's having with the black communists in Harlem, there also Rose Pastor Stokes sort of makes an attempt to recruit Harrison for the party. As Robert Hill put it, they wanted Harrison to be their stalking horse against Garvey. And Harrison opted not to do that, again, because I think he was skeptical of white funding and the way in which he had seen white funding corrupt the NAACP in certain ways or moderate its position, and what Du Bois was doing, that white funding had been this, responsible for the conservatism of the Tuskegee Institute and Booker T. Washington's aversion to political struggle. Not to mention, the sort of mainstream Democrats and Republicans who were, at best sort of tokenizing black figures in their party politics, much like the Socialist Party had done, with A. Philip Randolph and Chandler Owen in some ways. So yeah, he's got a skepticism towards the Communist Party. Even though he is working with black communists in Harlem when their interests are aligned about certain things. In terms of Latino politics, I appreciated that question you made as well, because one of Harrison's, as I mentioned earlier, one of his major friends was Arturo Schomburg, and Schomburg had been active in the struggle for Cuban and Puerto Rican independence, in the late 19th century, actually. Schomburg, for example, had actually served as secretary of Jose Marti's newspaper, Patria. But Schomburg, I think, grew disaffected by the kind of sectarian infighting that he saw in the Cuban and Puerto Rican independence movements. And he also, Schomburg, came to identify more strongly with the black struggle in the United States and his Afro, Caribbean background. Schomburg's mother was from Barbados, and he had an Afro-Caribbean sort of consciousness that was emerging, which I think he didn't feel maybe was adequately represented in the sort of official parties that were fighting for Cuban and Puerto Rican independence. So that was really the basis around which Harrison and Schomburg sort of came together, as they had this deep interest in African politics, African history, African culture, their own African heritage, as Afro-descended Caribbean peoples. And they kind of sort of focused on that, right? Schomburg becomes really focused on building this archival collection of books and, literature of, by, and about people of African descent. But certainly there were a lot of Caribbean communities, right, in Harlem. And there were, people from Jamaica, from Barbados, from Cuba, from Puerto Rico, from all kinds of different Caribbean locales. And I think there was a lot of sort of island-based associations, right? An association for the Jamaicans, an association for the Virgin Islanders, an association. And so Harrison is certainly part of that milieu, even though he dies in 1927. before the maturation of some of those organizations and struggles could really come to fruition. His death is suspicious. I write a little bit about this in the conclusion, because he went in for an appendix operation, which was supposed to be a kind of routine operation, and he seemed to be recovering fine after the day after the surgery, and was even entertaining guests and visiting with folks. And then that night, something happened, and he turns up dead the next morning. So I raised questions about whether, there was any foul play in Harrison's death, given that, the operation seemed to proceed fine and he was recovering before something happened that night, Friday night, and he turns up dead on Saturday. I don't have any smoking gun evidence about this, but I think the family was skeptical of the kind of official story, and so I think there's questions to raise about it, and maybe perhaps more research to be done. Um, Wanted to thank you, Steve, for bringing up the Mamdani point, because yeah, I mean that quote that you shared very much sounds like Mamdani's some of his policies, right? As far as groceries, city-run grocery stores and freezing rent so that the conscienceless landlords don't get to exploit people as much. Um, and I do think there's a lot to learn from history about the socialist movement and particularly social democracy, right? Which is a bit of a double-edged sword because in some ways it's more accessible and more popular than maybe a more revolutionary type of socialism. But it also comes with its limitations, right? And we've seen those limitations not just in the betrayals of the Second International during World War One, but much more recently, people like Bernie Sanders and AOC, who, have certainly struggled to name a genocide for far too long until it was almost unavoidable that they had to do that. Not to mention other foreign policy places where Bernie has, supported U.S. imperialism in Yugoslavia, for example, or supporting the F-35s in the Vermont National Guard. There's ties that he's cultivated with the military-industrial complex in Vermont that I think are problematic. So I think I think we should be excited and hopeful with Zoran, but also, keen to hold him accountable, and not assume that we can just sit back and rest on our laurels now, because the history of social democracy is that when push comes to shove, they can actually become very treacherous. I'm talking about the murder of Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht, for example, under a social democrat government in Weimar, Germany. And other examples, throughout history where they've sort of played a role in perpetuating the status quo in ways that require much more concerted and radical and revolutionary challenges from their left.
Um, when you were showing your slides, there was one slide that had a QR code for the book,
Yeah,
and maybe you could put that up again.
sure.
And also, I feel like you have remarkable energy, but I guess that goes with the territory of teaching. And speaking of which, maybe you could say a little bit about what you're researching now or teaching now and what else we should be reading. Oh yeah, so there's still the 30% discount. Good to know.
Yeah, yeah, please, if anyone has not gotten the book yet, I promise you will not be disappointed. Or I should say you will learn a lot from this book because I poured my heart and soul into it. It's a 12-year labor of love. I've been joking with people. I just gave birth to a 12-year-old. Um, it's jam-packed, full of ideas, full of arguments, full of hidden histories. Um, you know, Everything from hidden labor history to the Russian Revolution. I talk a lot about the Russian Revolution and sort of the relationship of that to what's going on in Harlem. Um, and so, yeah, I invite and encourage people to get the book. And just really, I just really, I think it opens up a whole number of different questions, because Harrison is such a multidimensional, figure and has so many different radicalisms in his frame of reference, as a socialist, as a free thinker, as a free lover, as an anti-imperialist, as a black radical and race conscious. There's a lot of angles of vision that, I sort of try to present in this book on different questions, and it covers a lot of different ground. Everything from science and technology and climate justice to questions of arts and culture and poetry. The Langston Hughes poems that I include in the book, for example, are a nice sort of element in the mix.
Yeah, there were so many side things, and maybe you were being uh, generous or charitable that, like when you, one thing popped in my head, like when you mentioned Margaret Sanger's influence, you didn't beat the reader over the head, but you also didn't assume readers today had any idea who she was. It's just a lot of very nice touches. How you
Mm,
ex- extended your reach. Just very well done.
thank you.
What are you
Thank
working on now? We can't wait.
you. Well, as I said, this one took 12 years. So the main thing I'm working on now is the book tour for this book. Getting into more bookstores and more conferences and more podcasts. Because, having spent so much time on the book and journeyed with Harrison in such a special way, I realized that I couldn't just let this book sit on a shelf somewhere and have people not read it or not know about it.
Yeah.
So yeah, that the main thing is getting the word out about this book and getting into as many different venues as I can with it. I'll be going to Detroit next week. I don't know if anybody here is in Detroit, but I'll be in Atlanta the week after that. I've been in Chicago, I've been in Washington, D.C., and Cincinnati, Ohio, and a whole number of places. And of course, next year, in the new year, I'll also be traveling and book touring as well. So that's really the main thing I'm trying to do at this point. It's hard to think of a future project. I mean, I have some ideas, and I'll be starting to work on them in whatever ways I can. But for now, the main thing is celebrating that the book is finally out and making sure that people know about that.
Yeah. Well, I also feel not 12 years, but certainly more than 6 months because we read it here before, or maybe we had just started reading Black Reconstruction, and it sort of has um, cast a shining light on us as we went through several books about Reconstruction and then the modern era. So it's just very big influence. And I can say that, if you do start thinking in new directions, any ideas you want to bounce off us, we'd love for you to come back and talk
Thanks.
about new work.
Thanks so much. Yeah, I mean, it's great. It's great to be connected to you all. I know that, there's not a lot of Marxist organizations, that exist, but that all the more reason that the ones that do, that we keep them alive. And so it's a pleasure and an honor to be here doing that with y'all, because I do think, these are traditions that are very precious, especially in a time like now where there's so much repression and censorship and so many penalties that are imposed for speaking out against injustice. And the tools that our tradition has to offer remain just as relevant, painfully relevant now as they ever have been. And so, just one simple example of that I've been reflecting on lately is the kind of global consciousness that I think people have woken up to or started to, certainly in the last 2 years, not just with the genocide in Gaza, but an understanding that there's terrible things happening in the Congo and in Sudan, and in Haiti, and pretty soon in Venezuela. I mean, it looks like the U.S. is, preparing to wage war on Venezuela. And so the anti-imperialist, sort of connection of all this stuff, that I think is really another example of sort of the critical role that we can play, or that our tradition has to offer, to people who are trying to make connections between all these different issues that are going on in the world, and sort of seeing the bigger picture in that sense.
Mm-hmm.
I see
Linda,
Linda has a hand up. Yeah.
yeah, you
Linda, I
need to
think you're
unmute.
muted.
Just to add to what you're saying and what people have said so far about the whole subject of sorry, my mind went blank there for a second. Counter hegemony and the whole, and on a global level. And what you're saying, like the lessons that we can learn from Brian, from you too, from Harrison, in terms of how do we publicize so that people, like you were talking about AOC and burning, kind of in a way, they just don't want to make that leap and bold, and be bold about, I don't think they feel secure enough to do that. But if we don't, my thinking is if we don't find a way to actually present socialism, communism, and so forth, Marxism, in a way that is genuinely exciting, I don't see how it's going to happen. I don't see how we're going to end up overturning, replacing what exists. It's so powerful what exists. But if there's a way to, how when you tell someone, a young person, not to do something, don't read this book, and they're going to read it. How do we work from that kind of an angle and other angles to just flip this whole thing? Because it seems to me, if we're talking about someone like Harrison, who was so powerful in his ability to get across his message, and we're also now at this point talking about not single individuals, but from a group standpoint. So now we're talking about organic intellectuals and how we put our heads together so that it really happens.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think one of the key things is making use of social media, right? Because not only because it's a way that sort of our media system is geared, right? The way we take and consume, but especially for young people, because the youth are the future. And so one of the things I've tried to do is to put out some content on Instagram, as a way to kind of, offer not just ways for people to get this book, but also just information that's in the book, So I have some posts that just talk about Harrison's, contributions to socialist theory and practice, his anti-imperialism, right? And I want to do more on other topics, even besides Harrison or besides my book, because, I teach African American history and U.S. history, at the University of Memphis. So I would like to actually put more of my course content on a whole range of different subjects and historical figures and movements. I teach a course on Black revolutions, for example, and so the Haitian Revolution is one Black revolution that I find fascinating, and I think has a lot of sort of rich lessons to offer us about the possibilities for transformation, even in a quote unquote impoverished context, that are really, really relevant today, given what's happening in Haiti and so many other places. So yeah, I think you're, yeah, right on. That's what we got to do.
Yeah.
well, we're probably about coming to the end. I'll just sneak in one last comment, which is that in another reading group here, we're reading a different biography, which is, but also very new, even newer, biography of Octavia Butler. And, she was not an immigrant, but she was raised in a poor single family, a single parent, working class household, and also she was largely self-educated, and had to, when she started writing, really still was working in warehouses and in other working class jobs, and was struggling almost her entire life to make ends meet, even after she started having recognition. So it was a different kind of pathway, but something that has struck me reading both books at the same time, she also evolved a lot of her own ideas about the environment, about post-capitalism, about dealing with racism in the culture and politics, and put that into her fiction and influenced people who are much more mainstream now, like Toni Morrison, but also people who were uh, writing at, who were her age. She also died young under surprising circumstances. And just strikes me that, another example of someone who came to fairly radical assessment of Western civilization, in quotes, through her own efforts and her own sometimes pretty stressful interactions with the intellectual world that she was in, which was like the very white male world of science fiction. So yeah, it's just been interesting weaving one chapter after the other of both books. So I encourage everybody to also read this. Very new. And also, I would say that, like what you said about Jeff Perry's biography, there's a very big, thick intellectual biography of Butler by Jerry Canavan, who also has come and spoken here. But for something that weaves in what was going on in the country and the world while she was writing and explains the life and times of Octavia Butler, this book is also great. So it's just good that people with, positions in academia can write books for regular people as well.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that about that book. I was not aware of it. And yeah, I can only imagine how generative it must be to read that book and my book at the same time. One thing I wanted to mention, but I forgot earlier. This is something that I just wanted to share that Carl had brought up this in the story about, Wilson initially thinking he would proclaim the right of nations to self-determination, and then realizing that, oh, it was only white nations that the Europeans would want that to apply to. It speaks to the false universality of white concepts, right? And so, for example, and one of the ways I learned this was I was a philosophy major at Cornell when I was an undergrad, and it wasn't until actually I graduated and some years later when I became aware of, philosophy as a discipline or as a mode of inquiry that could look at other issues like race and, African philosophy, feminist philosophy, Chinese philosophy. Like I had been reared on the stale pale males of Europe, and I was told that that was philosophy in a universal sense, only to later realize that it was actually, not a universal philosophical training, but something very narrow and specific to, relatively privileged white men in a handful of European countries. And so I think that lesson applies generally. Like we often have these concepts that are false universals, right? They claim to be universal, or they pitch themselves, they sell themselves as universal, when actually they're just something very particular. And so I'm grateful for Carl making that point, and I think it's one of the sort of lenses of critical analysis that we need to keep in mind whenever we're thinking about history and ideas and politics, is like who stands to gain, right? And who is benefiting and who is served by this concept or that concept? Where is this or that concept coming from? Whose interests is it reflecting, right? Or expressing? And so yeah, this has been a great conversation, and I hope I covered everything that anybody wanted to ask about. And I would be happy to come back if you all are doing something in the future, or want somebody extra to speak about some of the other readings you've done. Because as a professor of African American history, I'm in the world of books like Black Reconstruction and Hammer and Hoe, and some of the things that it seems like you guys are reading in other places. And so yeah, CLR James is another one. I don't know if y'all have read The Black Jacobins, but that's a really beautiful, groundbreaking Black Marxist history of the Haitian Revolution, which kind of changed my life in some ways. Walter Rodney, has some great books in a kind of Black or African Marxist frame. So yeah, I don't know what your whole schedule is, but it sounds like you're really branching out in ways that are important and generative.
Maybe we should
Yeah.
share with Steve, maybe we should share with Brian our two reading lists from the two classes. And
Yeah, we can do that, and maybe
yeah.
pick your brain about next year. As we end, I was going to just read there's another verse at the very end of the book, which actually I don't know if it's just copy editing mistake. It's not credited to anyone, so maybe you wrote it, or maybe it's from Langston Hughes. I don't recognize it. And I'll just mention we didn't get to everything because I wanted to talk about your idea of an event horizon for political ideas and so on. I mean, it was some really cool stuff. But you end the book with, "May we meet with his timeless and revolutionary spirit at crystalline onyx again and again, and keep listening for what the many stories of that untamable African touchstone still have to teach us." I assume those are your words.
Yes.
Yeah, it's just a beautiful way to end such a serious book. It's just perfect.
Thank you. Well, yeah, I had to end in a way that I think would leave people with the sense that he's not gone, but he's coming back. And like this book is a reclamation among whatever many other things it might be. It's a historical reclamation, and so although there's some sadness and grief about his absence for so long, perhaps there's some joy and excitement that Harrison is now in a position with books like mine. He's in a position to return to the scene, so to speak, and to continue to inform how we think about all these questions of race and class and gender and sexuality and imperialism and so on and so forth. And so, yeah, I wanted to give people a sort of uplifting note of, hey, he's coming back, so let's keep coming back to him.
Right. He's over the event horizon, but we're going to find a way to
We're going to
get
bring him into orbit.
there.
He's been beyond the event horizon, but now he's coming into orbit.
Yeah. So thank you so much, Brian, and thank you to everybody who participated. And good luck on the road with the book. And
Thank you.
yeah,
Thank
and
you, Steve.
I put in the chat your Instagram feed, which is cool.
Yes.
And, yeah, let's stay in touch. Thank you.
Sounds good. I'll put my website as well in case people want to find me there.
Yeah.
But yeah, thanks again, Steve, and everybody who made this possible. And yeah, I'm grateful for the opportunity, and I support y'all on your own quest, to do all these different readings and branch out on all these really exciting ways. Thank you for allowing me to be a part of that.